We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. But I need you to stop for a second, because I've been covering this case for weeks now. And most of what you've seen in the media, the headlines, the updates, the statements, barely scratches the surface of what is actually happening underneath this investigation. What I'm about to walk you through tonight is not just a missing persons case. It is not a random incident, and it is not in any way a simple story. What I'm about to walk you through tonight is the evidence of a planned, structured, coordinated operation, one that investigators believe did not start on the night Nancy disappeared, and may not have ended there either. And that changes everything. Before we go any deeper, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to cover the cases that go beyond the headline, the ones where the real story is buried underneath layers that most people never look through. If that's what you came here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this one has layers, and we're going deep tonight. The moment the federal operation began, it did not feel like a routine escalation. There was no public announcement, no early morning press alert, no visible urgency that the outside world could immediately recognize. But inside the federal chain of command, something had shifted. Because by the time that tactical unit was deployed to the second property connected to Tomaso Cioni, the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had already crossed a threshold that investigators rarely speak about publicly. It had moved beyond a single incident. It had moved into something structured, something layered, something that no longer fit within the boundaries of what most people would recognize as a conventional abduction case. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand what investigators already knew before that door was ever breached. By that point, the Nancy Guthrie investigation had been active for weeks. Thousands of tips had been processed. Digital evidence had been analyzed. Movement patterns had been mapped. Multiple investigative tracks had already begun converging. But one pattern kept appearing again and again. Not chaos. Not randomness. Structure. That structure showed up first, in the timeline. The timestamps from Nancy Guthrie's home were not scattered. They were precise. The camera going offline. The pacemaker signal disconnecting. The movement window between those two moments. Nothing overlapped by accident. Everything followed sequence. And sequence is not something investigators ignore, because sequence suggests planning. Then came the second layer. Movement. Not just movement on the night of the disappearance, but movement in the days and weeks leading up to it. Patterns of presence. Repeated positioning. Signals appearing in places they did not belong, and then disappearing. Not randomly. Deliberately. That is when the case changed. Because when investigators begin to see patterns that extend beyond a single night, they stop asking what happened. They start asking, how long had this been happening? That shift matters more than anything else. In an investigation like this, a one-night event can be chaotic, but a repeated pattern requires infrastructure. And infrastructure leaves traces. That is how the second property entered the investigation. Not as a random discovery. Not as a tip that appeared out of nowhere, but as a point that kept surfacing when different threads were pulled: surveillance data, movement analysis, associational links, each one pointing, quietly but consistently, toward the same location. A house that appeared empty. From the outside, it did not stand out. Neighbors described it the same way they describe any property that's been sitting unused for too long: quiet. Still. Unremarkable. No vehicles coming and going. No lights turning on at night. No visible signs of life. And that is exactly what made it important. Because in high-level investigations, a property that looks completely inactive can sometimes be the most active location of all. Think about what an active home creates. Noise. People notice patterns. They remember movement. They question changes. They talk. But a property that appears abandoned, it becomes invisible. It fades into the background. It stops existing in the memory of the people around it. And once something disappears from memory, it becomes the perfect place to hide activity. That is the principle investigators were working with when they began focusing on that house. Not suspicion, pattern recognition. Before the tactical team was ever deployed, that location had already been studied. Quietly, carefully. Over time, utility records were reviewed. Not just whether power was active, but how it was being used. Because a truly empty house behaves differently from one that is being maintained for a purpose. Even minimal usage leaves a signature, and those signatures rarely match what people expect. Surrounding surveillance was analyzed. Not just cameras on the property itself, but cameras in the area, entry points, roadways, intersections, places where movement might briefly appear before disappearing again. And then came behavioral mapping, not of the house, but of the person connected to it. Tommaso Cioni. By that stage, his movements were no longer being viewed in isolation. They were being mapped against locations, against timing, against patterns that did not match normal routine behavior. That is when the connection solidified. Because investigators documented repeated visits, not frequent enough to attract attention, but consistent enough to establish something far more important than frequency. Intent. And intent is everything. Because once intent is established, a location stops being incidental and starts becoming functional. That is what that house became in the eyes of the investigation. Not an abandoned property, a functional space. And once that determination is made, the approach changes entirely. You don't send standard investigators. You don't treat it like a routine search. You treat it as an operational site. That is why the tactical team was deployed. Not because of what was confirmed, but because of what was possible. When a property is suspected to be part of a structured operation, the risks change. Unknown individuals may be present. Evidence may be sensitive or intentionally concealed. And the environment itself may have been prepared to resist intrusion. So the team that approached that house did not approach it casually. They approached it expecting resistance, expecting complexity, expecting that whatever was inside had been placed there for a reason. And when they crossed that threshold, they understood immediately that the preparation had not been unnecessary. Because the house was not empty. Not in the way it appeared. The first thing that stood out was not a single object. It was the absence of randomness. In a truly abandoned space, disorder builds naturally over time. Dust accumulates unevenly. Objects shift. Environmental factors create irregular patterns. Nothing stays controlled. But inside that house, control was still present. Subtle, but unmistakable. Items were positioned with intention. Not scattered. Not left behind carelessly. But placed. Maintained. Preserved in a way that suggested ongoing interaction. That alone was enough to change the direction of the search. Because it meant one thing clearly. Someone had been there recently. And not just once. Then came the second layer. Technology. Not a single device. Not something temporary, but something structured. A system. The kind of system that does not get installed overnight. The kind that requires planning, access, knowledge, and purpose. Investigators recognized it immediately. Not because of what it looked like, but because of how it was arranged. The placement of devices. The direction they faced. The coverage they created. It was not improvised. It was designed. And that is where the implications began to expand beyond the original case. Because a system like that does not exist for a single moment in time. It exists for continuity. Which raises a question investigators are now forced to confront. If that infrastructure was not built for just one event, then what else was it used for? That question is still open. And it is one of the most critical questions in this entire investigation. Because what was found in that house does not just connect to Nancy Guthrie. It suggests something larger. Something that may have been operating long before February 1st. And possibly continued after. I want to pause here for just a second. Because if you've made it to this point in the video, you already understand why this case is different. Most channels cover the headline. We cover what's underneath it. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Every case we cover, we go this deep. Sometimes deeper. Subscribe. Drop a comment below with what you think is happening here, because I read every single one. Now let's keep going. The third layer is where things became even more complicated. Because, alongside the structured environment and the surveillance setup, there were items that did not belong. Not to the property, not to its documented ownership, and not to any known individual connected to it. Items that had to be there for a reason, but whose origin has not yet been fully explained. Investigators did not treat those items as background noise. They treated them as evidence with unknown ownership. And unknown ownership is one of the most difficult variables in any case. Because it introduces something investigators try to control at all times: uncertainty. Each item found inside that property had to be processed the same way. Photographed, logged, separated, analyzed, not just for what it was, but for what it represented. Because an object is never just an object inside a structured environment. It is a trace of presence, and presence means someone was there. The first layer of analysis is always physical. Material composition, wear patterns, residue, DNA. But the second layer is behavioral. And that is where this becomes more complex. Investigators began asking a simple but critical question. Not, what is this? But, how did it get here? Because there are only a limited number of ways an item ends up inside a controlled location. It is brought in deliberately. It is used and left behind. Or it belongs to someone who was there, without control over what happened next. Each possibility leads in a different direction. If the item was brought intentionally, it suggests planning. If it was left behind, it suggests activity. If it belonged to someone who lost possession of it, that suggests something else entirely. And that third possibility is the one investigators approach most carefully, because it introduces a scenario that expands beyond the original case. They do not jump to conclusions. They do not assume, but they do not ignore patterns either. And patterns were beginning to emerge, not in a way that could be announced publicly, not in a way that could be confirmed immediately, but in a way that required deeper cross-referencing. Investigators began comparing those items against existing records, missing property reports, open cases, unresolved disappearances, not because they had proof of connection, but because the structure of the environment demanded it. A controlled space with unidentified belongings does not exist in isolation. It connects outward. That is when the scope of the investigation began to widen, carefully, quietly, without public acknowledgement. Because widening a case prematurely creates risk, but ignoring expansion creates blind spots. So investigators did what they always do at this stage. They verified. To understand why that matters, you have to step away from the image most people have in their minds when they hear the word surveillance. Most people imagine a camera, a single angle, a fixed recording, something passive. That is not what was being suggested inside that house. What investigators encountered pointed to something far more complex. A layered system, one that did not simply observe, but processed. Because surveillance at a certain level is not about watching. It is about learning. And learning requires repetition, consistency, time. That is what makes this part of the investigation so critical. Because the presence of a structured surveillance network suggests that whatever operation was being supported here, it was not spontaneous. It required observation over time. Investigators began reconstructing what that would look like in practice. Not in theory. In real-world behavior, imagine a location being monitored. Not once, but repeatedly. Not just for entry and exit, but for routine. What time lights turn on. What time they turn off. When movement happens. When it doesn't. Patterns that seem completely ordinary to the person living them, but become data points to someone watching from a distance. This is where the investigation begins to move into deeply uncomfortable territory. Because it introduces the possibility that Nancy Guthrie's life was not only interrupted on February 1st Street, it was studied long before it. And that distinction changes everything. A crime that happens in one moment can be explained as a reaction. Impulsive, uncontrolled, even, in some minds, understandable. But a crime built on observation is something else entirely. It is planned, it is deliberate, and it was chosen. Investigators began asking a different set of questions. Not what happened that night, but what led up to that night. And the answers were not found in one place. They were found across systems, digital records, network interactions, device activity. Even something as simple as how a signal moves through a space can tell investigators more than people realize. Because every device communicates, even when no one is actively using it. Phones check for networks. Routers log connections. Systems record interactions. And those interactions leave patterns that can be reconstructed. That is what makes a surveillance network different from a simple device. It does not just capture moments, it builds history. And history is what investigators were now looking for. Inside that house, the structure suggested continuity. Not temporary usage, not a one-time setup, but something that had been maintained. Maintenance is one of the most overlooked indicators in investigations like this. Because anyone can place an object in a room, but keeping that object functional over time requires intention. It requires someone returning, checking, adjusting, ensuring that everything remains operational. That is where the timeline begins to stretch. Because once investigators establish that a system has been maintained, they can begin estimating how long it has been in place. And in this case, the indicators did not suggest recent installation. They suggested duration, which raises a question that becomes very difficult to ignore. If this system was not installed for a single event, then what was it originally built for? That question does not yet have a confirmed answer, but it is now central to the investigation. There is a question investigators are now forced to ask that extends far beyond the original case. Who was being watched, and for how long? That question does not just apply to Nancy Guthrie. It applies to anyone connected to the environment that was being monitored. Family members, visitors, neighbors, anyone whose presence may have intersected with that system. Because surveillance does not discriminate once it is active. It records everything within its reach, which means the data being processed inside that house may extend far beyond what investigators initially expected. This is where the investigation becomes both technical and deeply human at the same time. Because while analysts are reconstructing patterns and systems, there is a family living through something much simpler. Not knowing where someone is, not knowing what happened in full, not knowing when the answers will come. That kind of uncertainty does not stay still. It follows you. It shows up in quiet moments. In routine, in places that used to feel normal. Because when someone disappears, the absence does not remain in one place. It spreads. Through conversations, through memory, through everyday life. And for Nancy Guthrie's family, that absence is constant, because this case has not ended. Not for them, and not for investigators. Because until one thing happens, the case remains open in the only way that matters. Nancy has not been found. That is the reality at the center of everything. No matter how much has been uncovered, no matter how much has been analyzed, the outcome is still incomplete. And that is what makes this stage of the investigation so critical. Because this is where pressure builds. Not just from law enforcement, but from time. Time affects everything. In a case like this, physical environments change. Data becomes harder to retrieve, memories shift, but time also creates something else. Pressure on the people who know something. Because silence becomes harder to maintain. The longer a case continues, the more unstable that silence becomes. People talk. Not always immediately, not always directly, but eventually, information moves, and investigators know that. There is a fundamental difference between someone who reacts in the moment and someone who builds structure ahead of time. Reaction is immediate, emotional, uncontrolled. Structure is the opposite. It is deliberate, measured, maintained. It requires patience. It requires discipline. And most importantly, it requires the ability to think beyond a single event. That is what investigators are now trying to understand. Not just what happened, but who would create something like this. Because the environment inside that house was not chaotic. It was organized, and organization reveals intent. Every placement of equipment, every maintained element, every preserved condition. It all points to one thing: continuity. Someone expected to return. Someone expected the system to remain in use. That changes the profile entirely. Because now investigators are not looking at a one-time offender. They are looking at someone who operates over time. Someone who prepares. Someone who observes. Someone who adapts. And that type of behavior is not impulsive. It is controlled. That control becomes visible in small ways. The absence of disturbance. The consistency of layout. The condition of objects. These are things most people would overlook. But to investigators, they are signals. Signals that the environment was not abandoned. It was managed. And management requires presence. That brings the investigation back to movement. Because if someone was managing that space, they had to be accessing it repeatedly. Not just once, not just occasionally, but consistently enough to maintain its condition. That is where earlier surveillance data becomes critical. Patterns of movement that once seemed insignificant now take on new meaning. Short visits, irregular timing, routes that do not match routine behavior. Each one, a data point. And when those data points are layered together, they form a pattern of access. And access has a purpose. At the same time, another realization begins to take shape. If this system existed, and if it was maintained, then it was not isolated. It was part of something larger. Not necessarily a large group, Not necessarily a network in the traditional sense, but a structure that extended beyond a single location. Multiple locations, multiple functions, multiple roles, each serving a purpose within the same framework. That is why the second property matters so much. Because it is not the origin. It is a node, a point within a larger structure. And identifying one node means there may be others. At a certain point in every investigation, the questions stop multiplying and the focus narrows. Not because everything has been answered, but because investigators begin to understand which answers matter most. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that moment has already come. Multiple investigative tracks are now feeding into the same central objective: digital forensics, physical evidence, behavioral analysis, geographic mapping. Each one has produced something. But more importantly, each one is now being compared against the others. Because when independent lines of evidence begin to overlap, that is when a case becomes actionable. Investigators are looking for those points of convergence, where a digital pattern matches a physical location, where a behavioral profile matches a timeline, where movement data aligns with opportunity. Those intersections are where cases break open. And based on everything currently known, those intersections are forming, not publicly, not in a way that can be announced yet, but internally, the direction is becoming clearer. That is why the tone from law enforcement has remained controlled. They are not speculating. They are not expanding publicly. Because once the structure of a case is understood, the next step is not discussion. It is action. This case has returned to the same place it started. A single person, Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman who was inside her home, and is no longer there. Everything else, the structures, the systems, the analysis, exists around that fact. And now investigators are no longer asking what happened here. They are asking, where is she? Because that is the one question that has not been answered. And it is the one that matters most. This is no longer just about what happened on one night. It is about what was built before that night ever began. If you're watching this, there is something important to understand. Cases like this are not solved by one person alone. They are solved through information. And sometimes that information comes from places no one expects. A detail that seemed unimportant. A moment that didn't stand out at the time. A pattern that only makes sense in hindsight. If you have seen anything, heard anything, or remember something that feels even slightly out of place, that matters. Even if you're not sure. Investigators would rather review 100 small details than miss the one that makes the difference. FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. Online, tips.fbi.gov. There is currently a $1 million reward available. That reward can be claimed anonymously. No name. No exposure. Just information. Because at this stage, what matters is not who you are. It is what you know. This case is not closed. It is not cold. And it is not finished. It is moving. And the people working it are closer than they were before. That is not speculation. That is how cases like this progress. Slowly, quietly, and then, all at once. Nancy Guthrie's story is not over. And until it is, people will keep watching. People will keep asking. And investigators will keep working. Because at the end of all of this, there is only one outcome that matters. Nancy comes home. That is the ending. And until that happens, this story continues.